I wish I could be with you today, but regardless, we'll have a chance here by way of technology to go through some ideas on basic score study and conducting. So let's dive right in. First of all, I just wanted to say that your textbook has a very detailed chapter on score study. You may have felt a little overwhelmed after reading all of that. Just realize that that gives you basically a graduate level of score study recommendations for a graduate level of score study. As a um, uh, music director especially in a school situation, you will rarely have time to do that in depth of a score study. At least follow all of their procedures and all of the recommendations. That's more what somebody who was conductor of a university group or professional group. That's the type of things they're thinking about. But it's really good that you have those there. It's really good you have a chance to just uh, take a quick glimpse inside the possibilities of score study. What I'd like you to do today with you is just to refine that a little bit and also to just mention some common pitfalls for young conductors that I see uh, as I observe young conductors, especially in their practicum student teaching, but even as conductors bring groups to festivals and other events here at BJU or others I've judged for in the past. So let's start out with some score study basics. First of all, it's imperative, as you might guess, that you are able to audiate the score. Now, this is not a skill that we spend a lot of time helping you to develop outside of your practicum and student teaching experiences, your practicum and your clinical practice. And this is something that takes everybody quite a while to get comfortable with. Looking at a score, especially not as much with strings, where you have 5 lines in the score, but with a symphony orchestra, with a concert band, where you can have 15, 20, 25, 30 different lines of music all going on at once. Eventually, your skill at being able to know what to look for as you are looking through a score and what to focus on will increase. But learning to audiate the score ahead of time, especially for a young conductor, but really for anybody, is kind of your time to prepare for using the score effectively in rehearsal instead of just burying your head in it and not being able to notice what the students are doing. So you can do this a few ways. You can just look through and if your notational audiation is high, look through and see where the different parts are, imagine how they sound, maybe play out some chords on the piano, kind of do a manual version. But I will tell you that despite what different people say, the quickest way to get to audiate a score is to listen to recordings. Now, purists will say, well, then that's going to put one interpretation in your mind. Frankly, if we can get our students to do one good interpretation in a school situation, we're really happy. But there is some merit to that. Maybe listen to different uh, recordings if they're available, just to get different ideas. But that's a huge shortcut that I've found in preparing yourself to use the score effectively. You'll want to go through and mark things like cues. Where are important entrances? Where is somebody entering after a while, after resting for a while? They may need your help, or that you just want to give confidence to certain lines to bring out and connect with them. Uh, Notice your time signature changes, mark them. Your tempo changes, mark them. And then anything you find yourself missing in rehearsal, just kind of keep a pencil handy, highlighter handy, mark as you go, whatever you like to use. I usually use the pencil just so I could erase things, but different people like different colors for different types of things, and you'll kind of make up your own system of score marking that works for you, and depending on how visual of a person you are and how much color means to you and those type of things probably has something to do with it as well. But there are a lot of good suggestions in our textbook for that too. But these are kind of the big things. Where you're going to need to where you're going to need to give cues, where are your time signature changes and your tempo changes, and then whatever you need to remember to focus on that you tend to miss as you conduct. So individual entrances and cutoffs, anytime you have an accelerando, retardando, mark that. And when I say mark it, you can circle it or you can write it in above the score in larger letters. There's another way to do it. Circle fermatas. You may just want to circle that whole chord down the page so that you can't miss it. And then after you've made some basic marks, as far as the analysis part of it, some of the basics that you'll want to for sure cover are things like the textural functions, which we mentioned, the melody, the counter melody, the rhythmic ostinato, the underlying chord sequences, rhythmic accompaniment of different kind. Those in a polyphonic piece, it may be different titles or names to some of those. In a fugue, they all have very specific names, but how the different voices are being used in the texture of the piece. Obviously, your meters, your tonalities, you should know these. Have them marked if you need to help remembering. Usually, you can tell fairly quickly on those. Mark out any and identify any unusual chords. You may have to help the students learn to audiate these, take them apart from the music, practice them in an exercise or in your warm-ups, and even an unusual chord progression. The style of the piece and what musical elements are going to have to happen in a particular way to bring that style out. And then expressive elements. Your dynamics, anything else written into the piece, articulations, and various musical style words that we have in different types of pieces. So these are things you want to identify, know in your mind, and maybe even talk through with the students as you're giving them things to listen for in a first read through or successive listen throughs or read throughs of the piece. And then try to anticipate the problem spots. You get much better at this the more experience you have, but with your level of playing, you can look at a score and at least find some of the difficult, high probability for difficulty areas of the piece. So whether it's pitches or shifting or tempos or uncommon rhythm patterns, ranges, whatever it may be, you can gradually, as you know your group more and more, very quickly and effectively find those spots and kind of make plans for your future rehearsals about how to address those. All right, so we're talking about audiating the score, marking cues, identifying core components of the piece, the contextual components especially, and then anticipating problem spots. Those are the basics that you'll go through on every piece that you conduct. To go beyond that is incredible if you have the time. You will learn a lot. You'll have more to teach your students, but just talking from practical experience, these are the things that you want to make sure you get to. All right, so now let's quickly go to some young conductor pitfalls. What are some of the things that I've seen as I've observed young conductors and as I think back on my own time developing as a conductor that you should be aware of and conscious of? And actually use this practicum time to start practicing effective strategies for overcoming these things. So, young conductor pitfalls. First of all, overconducting. Almost every young conductor I see overconducts. One of the best pieces of advice I had from one of my musical mentors was the more you want them to pay attention to the baton, the smaller you conduct. And you talk about that with the students. And the more precise you conduct. So if things are getting apart, instead of waving your hands and beating the air wildly, you want to be very succinct and very measured and very specific with your, especially where the ictus of the beat is. And that will actually help them to focus in and know exactly where they are in the measure, where they are in the beat more effectively. But this overconducting thing, I think a lot of it comes from those that have a marching band background too, where they're conducting for a whole football field, and they take that into the classroom. remember we talked about conducting as nonverbal communication. And if you can make every size and every shape and every specific gesture mean something to your students and practice that with your students, and we'll talk about some good drills for doing that in a little bit, then you will have an effective communication system, I guess, nonverbal communication system worked out with them. If you always overconduct, you're limiting the possibilities of the scope and size of the information that they can get, and how meaningful your gestures are. Basically, when you're conducting everything big, nothing means anything. So you're just more of a distraction than anything to them, although they may get some help out of it. So think of going from very small patterns for small dynamics to larger patterns for larger dynamics, and then we'll talk more about the different types of gestures a little bit later. Another thing to focus on right now is what I call thinking with the hand instead of the baton tip. So we're fairly comfortable moving our hands around, and we tend to move our hand as we would in choral conducting, as if that's the end or the focal point for the students of the conducting pattern. But in instrumental music, we often are using a baton. So if we're controlling the end of our hand, then the end of the baton is another foot or so out there, and that's going way larger and way less distinct than the tips of our fingers that we're holding the baton with are moving. So we need to learn to think with the tip of the baton and make sure that's giving what we're trying to show, giving the meaning we're trying to show instead of our hand. Something that kind of goes along with this overconducting, think and practice of conducting from your wrists a lot, moved a little bit by your elbow, more for larger dynamics, but some people will lock their wrists and just basically conduct with their shoulders and from their shoulders and elbows, and that's exhausting for a whole day, I'll just tell you, first of all. Secondly, it leads to overconducting and lack of precision in everything we're trying to get away from. So practice and think of moving from the wrist as you conduct, and that your elbow just basically puts your wrist in the location it needs to be for each beat a little bit. But your wrist really does a lot of it. You'll watch very sensitive conductors, those that are maybe sensitive conductors isn't the right word, but very specific conductors, you'll watch conduct from the wrist a lot more so than from some of the larger joints. And then excessive mirroring. In choral music, we do this more. It's a tradition. I can't tell you every reason why, but in instrumental conducting, it's traditional and frankly not needed to do everything with the left hand that you're doing with the right. So practice getting comfortable putting your left hand down by your side and just conducting with the right, unless there's something you need to emphasize, a cue, crescendo, some aspect of the music besides just the tempo and the beat and the basic look of the main conducting pattern. So it's not that you can't ever mirror, but think of mirroring as emphasis, not a constant. Again, mirroring most of the time is a form of overconducting, if you want to think of it that way. And then this is more of a rehearsal tip than a conducting pitfall, but young conductors tend to way overuse count-offs. You can teach your students to learn to get everything they need from your preparation gesture, and if you're conducting with a preparation gesture that is specific and precise, then they really don't need the count-off. Now, when are count-offs handy? When you're doing just getting a tempo established, or when you are rehearsing something over and over and gradually increasing the tempo, when you're trying to keep the rhythm, the feel of the rhythm and meter going. Then if you are using a count off, I would highly suggest you hold your hands still while you're doing a verbal count off until the preparation beat. That trains your students to still look at the preparation beat for the information, and we'll talk later about what the information they should get from the preparation beat. Some of this you have had or will have in instrumental conducting or other classes, but they're good reminders. So be precise and strategic in your use of verbal count-offs. You don't need a visual count-off. You don't need to conduct a full measure before they come in. Don't conduct until the preparation beat. At the most, a couple. If it's a real quick tempo, you might want to do two beats before. But really, if you give them a tempo with your other hand, and then let them have a measure so in their minds to audiate, give the preparation beat, preparation gesture, and come in. Then if you've trained them to do that, that's really all they need. You waste a lot of time by trying to conduct all these empty measures. Now, if your students aren't used to that, they'll have to get used to it, but it's something that you work with them to get. And then lack of a tonal emphasis. Again, this is more of a rehearsal technique than anything to do with conducting. But we've talked about this in class. Singing, both you demonstrating through singing or your instrument tonally, and having your students sing and demonstrate through their instruments tonally for pitch, for melody, for singing things with solfege, if you can get them to that point. All these things we've been talking about are so good for their audiation, so good for their internalizing the tonal part of music. And you'll watch young conductor after young conductor just focus on the rhythmic aspects. They may say something like, oh, we need to get that more in tune, but they don't have the kids sing. They don't stop and have them play and listen. They just really focus on the rhythmic precision side of things and really underemphasize the tonal side of things. Now, I will say that that's more of a band thing than a strings thing. If you do that in strings, you won't be able to stand listening to the group. So it's kind of self-preservation. But especially in young band, this is something I see a lot. And really, even in strings, they'll tend to play a lot and talk a lot about it, but they don't tend to sing as much. And so that's a way to both you and the students get them comfortable with connecting with the music by singing resting tones, by singing their main scales, patterns, or arpeggiated patterns, teaching them the common tonal patterns of music, having them learn to play them by ear, all those things that we've talked about in the first part of the course, and then applying that to their literature. So, overconducting, thinking with the hand instead of the baton tip, excessive mirroring, excessive use of count-offs, lack of tonal emphasis. I put these all in a negative way, but think of what you can do to practice the opposite. And as we go on for the rest of our time together today, we'll be talking about some of the things that you can do to help alleviate some of these pitfalls. All right, let me select our next presentation quickly here. And let's see, I need Keynote. This presentation is a more detailed review of something we've already gone over when we talked about warm-ups with the ensemble. And I've just, each of these presentations has a corresponding set of notes in Canvas, so you can look those up if you would like at any point, or download those after class. But here is basically that warm-up sequence that I talked about, helping to connect your students to the baton. Here it is laid out in kind of 4 steps or 4 groups of exercises. So exercise 1, individual pitches and chords. So here, remember, you're going to practice your entrances and cutoffs. And you'll give the band or orchestra, string group, a pitch, and you'll bring them in and you'll cut them off. And you're practicing precision, but you're also practicing some other things here. So we are focusing on precision, both of the entrance, the attack, and of the end of the sound, the cutoff. We're also focusing on learning to read the conducting for certain things. So you emphasize these with your students, and you practice getting them to be able to identify each of these things from your preparation beat. Remember, all we're doing is a single pitch or chord. So it's a preparation beat, holding it, and then a cutoff. What do they get from the gesture? Their breath, especially in woodwinds and brass. But many ensembles, it's good to teach your students to breathe and come in. It just kind of helps get the whole body in the motion of the music. What else? The attack, obviously, when to start the sound. The articulation. So you tell them the style of articulation from the gesture you're giving them. Is it marcato? Is it legato? Is it even staccato? What kind of and obviously there are other combinations and options as well. But just for example, teaching your students how to attack with those articulations. Also the dynamic. The size of your gesture should tell them what dynamic to play. And finally, the release. So attack and release, breath, articulation, dynamic. Talk about each of those, give them some options, help them practice the different options, and that's part of your conducting to your ensemble. As I've said with young students before, making your baton into a magic wand so that when you do a certain motion with it, a certain sound automatically comes out. They get a kick out of that. All right, so that's single pitches. Exercise 2, you're now working with scales. So you begin by holding each pitch. This is for tuning, for balance, blend, tone quality, all of those things. But also, this is kind of a continuation of the drill before, where you can conduct a number of pitches in a row, holding each one in the same style, in the same articulation, in the same dynamic, or eventually you can change it up and have them read what you're doing. We've done this for preparation for concerts. The last thing we do before I turn around and introduce the group and start, play some scale, and we'll just do this, and you can make a really musical exercise out of it by attacks, cutoffs, dynamics, crescendos, decrescendos, anything that you might conduct within the piece you can do with these held out scale notes, and then you end with the tonic at the top, give a cutoff, and I've had people applaud for that little drill before. It's kind of funny, but it does sound very musical once the students get good at it. So hold each pitch. You're going to listen for the sound. We talked about the sound. Remember, we're talking about tone quality, intonation, precision, balance, and blend on each of the pitches that we hold. We're practicing moving together, one attack, not 2 or 3 or 4, one cutoff, not 2 or 3 or 4. Practicing crescendos and decrescendos, so not just individual dynamics, but now crescendos, decrescendos. And we're going to vary attacks with our preparation gesture for each pitch. So every time we get a cutoff, we have a chance for a new preparation gesture, and we can give a different type of attack. Legato, staccato, marcato, 3 of your options there. And periodically cut them off and conduct in a new style. So this is just scales held out one note at a time, and it's establishing our sound, and it's connecting them to the conductor at a more advanced level than we did in the first exercise. Exercise 3, rhythm pattern scales. So now we're going to go up and down a commonly known scale to the students and perform a certain rhythm pattern on each scale degree. So if you're preparing them for duple meter, you might want something like do, do, day, do, to, day, to, do, ba, 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 ba. Play that pattern on each pitch, have them demonstrate it vocally, then apply it to each pitch of the scale. And with this, you're going to really focus on changing tempos. So they need to be able to internalize your tempo enough to perform rhythm patterns in the new tempo as you change. So this is practicing accelerando and retardando, and seeing how quickly your group can adjust to from one to the other, from one level to the other. Accelerando and retardando, abrupt shifts, not gradual. You can do those too. That really strains their tempo audiation, their metric audiation, but develops it as well. And then it's good to give patterns with multiple beat levels. You notice I did do, do, day, do, to, day, to, do. Have at least a couple beat levels, microbeat, to get the feeling of a meter. Da 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 da. You know, if you're in triple, ba 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 ba. If you're in uneven, or ba 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 ba, something like that, and then you just perform that rhythm pattern on each note of the scale, so you can prepare them for the literature they'll be playing, and also review just feeling tempos in various meters that way. various meters and functions, as I said. If there's a function that's tricky that you're going to be practicing in your literature, throw it into this exercise in the warm-ups. Syncopation pattern, ba-da, ba-da, ba, ba-da, ba-da, ba, ba-da, ba-da, ba, or da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, whatever the syncopation pattern is, pickup pattern, ties, whatever it is. You can put that in as your rhythm pattern scale. And then exercise 4, chorales and sight reading. These could be one or the other or both if you have time. Chorales, now we're going to make multi-part music instead of just a simple scale or rhythmic scale, and they are going to follow all of the gestures they've been practicing while they're making simple music. Chorales are slow, they're chordal, they're fairly homophonic, so there's not a lot of rhythmic variation usually compared to pieces they'll be working on, so they can really focus on your conducting and applying it to reading music. So focus on phrasing and fermatas while you're conducting the chorales. Also vary your tempo, style, and dynamics phrase by phrase. If there's a multi-phrase chorale, that gets them really in tune to paying close attention. And remember, they can't look up at you while they're reading music, so they have to learn to do this either with quick glance ups and back down, or especially out of their peripheral vision. And you have to be specific enough with your conducting and precise enough that they can learn to read it in their peripheral vision. You talk about that with them. And then sight reading. This is the most difficult time to have them gain information from your conducting because they're really focusing on the notation. But if they can do it then, they can do it anytime. So focus on conducting written expressive elements and helping them out in that way, giving very clear where each beat is, where each measure is, and focus on those expressive elements in your conducting. All right. So here's kind of a 4 exercises that gradually increase in complexity that help your students learn your nonverbal communication system called conducting. Some key concepts just to review really quickly. Teach the ensemble to interpret and coordinate with your conducting. Otherwise, they'll tend to get started and then just look at their page and you can be up there waving your hands and it's not doing anything for them. You have to intentionally in warm-ups and then applying it to their music, work on developing this system together. And then give ample opportunity to practice during warm-ups. It's not just a one-time thing. The older the students, the more they can probably remember, but everyone needs repetition. So do something in each warm-up, at least one level of those drills in each warm-up to connect them to the conducting and to practice, giving them a chance to practice accurately representing your conducting and sound. And then help the ensemble apply their skills while reading literature like we just talked about. Finally, let's move on to a topic that you read about, the Laban movement efforts. And I just want to expand on these a little bit because in my own understanding of musical expression and of conducting, these were extremely helpful for just making categories in my mind, categories of movement, and ways to put sound into gestures that were consistent and made sense. If you, in many universities, if you take a graduate course in conducting, they'll either address these specific Laban movement efforts or at least reference them, or something similar, whether they have you study this exact system or not. But Rudolf Laban, remember, was about dance instruction, and one of his great contributions to the world, to the arts, was a system for codifying and notating complex dances. But he also, one of the most valuable things to musicians was verbalized and categorized and verbalized the different types of gestures that we could make with our body, the movements that we could make with our body, if you want to think of it that way. So let's dive into some of these. What are his movement efforts? They're continuums, so they go from one to the other, and you're always somewhere between the two, not exactly on one or exactly on the other. usually, but um, the first one he emphasizes flow. So flow is the interaction of the other three, of weight, space, and time. Okay, well that's not very helpful unless we know what weight, space, and time are, right? So let's talk about those. Weight, we're talking about light to heavy. So thinking moving in a way that looks light, as in the weight of it, or heavy motions. And we'll get a lot more detail in a second. Space, we're talking indirect to a direct. Um, Ways of moving in space is what we're describing here. Direct motion, going straight for something, indirect, kind of wandering around. And then time, quick to slow, or we could think of quick to sustained. Um, and this is how we're using motion in time. What speed, if we want to think of it that way, of motions are we using, or musical sounds. So when we're thinking of the flow that we have, that's kind of how all of these work together. So let's just start out with flow itself. What are some of the specifics, boundaries of the continuum? And with flow, we're thinking of bound to free. Now, what do I mean by bound and free? This is where it would be helpful for me to be in front of you, but if you can imagine me kind of tensing up all my muscles and then trying to move around, or just moving with a lot of resistance, if you want to think of it that way, versus just kind of a floating around, um, very relaxed type of gesture. That's what we're talking about with bound to free. You can also have continuous flow, which we've talked about continuous flow motion a lot with our audiation, instruction, and rhythm. Or you can have continuous flow with pulsations, where we're moving around and putting little, basically ictuses, if you want to think of it, and the macrobeats or microbeats. And then you can have an interrupted or erratic flow. So continuous versus interrupted or erratic. Or you can have continuous with pulsations. And you can do any of these in a bound to free manner. So these are some of the words, some of the ideas that Laban connected with the idea or the concept of flow. Weight, we think light to heavy. That makes sense, right? So if you think of yourself moving around, well, you're as light as a feather or as heavy as an elephant, and how you would look differently, then think of conducting in those ways and what kind of sounds would be appropriate to put with one or the other end of the spectrum. So here we're thinking light to heavy. We can also think gentle to strong motions. That's a way that students, especially young students, understand maybe a little better. And with especially again with younger students, we could think of giving rides on our hand to different size or weights of animals. Or to even objects. Here, let's give a blueberry a ride around the room and show them different things up high and down low. And now let's put a bowling ball in your hand and give that a ride. And how do you feel different and how do you look different when you're doing those two things? Is one way to kind of get them to that, and then having them move to music that feels one way or the other, and connecting that is where you head in elementary music with that. But you as a conductor, that may just be a word picture that helps you to latch onto this idea of weight a little better. Space. So we have direct to indirect. That's our continuum. We could think of straight to curvy. So going right from one directly to the other, or kind of looping around places, and you can immediately imagine the differences in the look of a conducting pattern that's one versus the other. We can also think as people of self-space or shared space. Now, in music, this may be more of an open or a crowded feeling that we're trying to get across, but that's one of the continuums of space that we need to think about as well. And then stationary and locomotor. Stationary is when we'd be moving while we keep our feet in one place on the ground. We're sitting in a chair. We're not moving around physically in the space other than just in our own little spot. That's stationary. Locomotor is when you're walking around, running around, changing your position within the larger three-dimensional area that you occupy, the room that you occupy. And then you can think of open to closed space. Closed space has our limbs all brought in near our body. Open space has them out further away from our body. And again, all these have direct ties into things that we can do in conducting. And then time. Here we're thinking sustained to quick. That's the continuum. Or we could think of slow to fast if you want to say it that way. Oh, and that's it. Oh, okay, there we go. And this is our tempo in conducting, basically. Now I'm going to skip over this slide because we can't do this activity without each other, so I'll give you a different one at the end here today. But where these really become interesting, besides just in a theoretical manner, are in his combinations of those things. So Laban categorized 8 different specific types of motions that are the different combinations you can get out of those options I just gave you. So first of all, he talks about the punch, which is a direct, quick, heavy, and bound motion. Punch. Think of a conducting gesture that would mimic a punch. Then there's the slash. This is indirect instead of direct. It's still quick and heavy, but it's more free instead of bound. Think of a conducting pattern that looks more like a slash. When you watch famous conductors of an orchestra, and when they're really getting going for the crowd, a lot of times they'll use at large motions in the music, a lot of these slashing motions. Then there's dab. This is direct, quick, light, and bound. So kind of like punch, but with a lot less weight to it. This would be a staccato motion, possibly, or something that we're wanting to emphasize and get off of. And flick. This is indirect, quick, light, and free. So again, flicking, something that may be good for staccato, especially a softer staccato type of motion. Press. This is direct, sustained, heavy, bound. So here we're sustained, we're slower tempo, but we're keeping that muscular tension in our gesture or in our motion, and the music that would go along with that kind of being slower but intense and I think of like thick, like you're walking through molasses almost. But with the idea of pressing something down, it has that muscular tension in it, and it's a slower motion than a punch by far, or a slash or dab or flick. Then there's ring. With ring, this one's probably the hardest one to apply to conducting, but think of wringing water out of a towel. So it's kind of a indirect, sustained, heavy bound motion. You could do this, especially in gestures that you were giving with your left hand, maybe a little bit with your right hand, more of a circular motion, but that would be if you're directing stylistically more than precise metric conducting at that point, I think. And then glide, direct, sustained, light, and free. In this one, we could have many softer legato style pieces would fit with a glide type motion. So just kind of getting these words in your mental vocabulary, and these are ways to address different, representing different styles of music, basically different tempos, different dynamics, different sounds that you're trying to have your ensemble create, how to express those visually. And then float. This is indirect, sustained, light, and free. So this is very, I think of Debussy when I think of float. Feels like a very ethereal, very non-metric, quieter, and some of the just almost like almost like you're a bubble, just kind of making your way, moved here and there by the breeze a little bit, but it's a gentle breeze. Often music will have that effect that you're trying to get across too. So what I'd really like you guys to do is just think about, when you are preparing music, which of these types of movements, of these effort combinations, would be most expressive way to visually communicate the sound that you want to your students. And it'll take practice to differentiate between each of these. But if you just have some categories, some parameters to start with like this, I think you can make progress fairly quickly compared to if you're just going with whatever comes naturally, which might be fine, but you might be kind of limited in the options of what you're thinking of. So, what are some applications here? We use these to connect sound to sensation. Remember, music, we'll talk more about this, but music represents commonly experienced sensations of life in sound and, and elicits sensations within the listener or groups or combinations of sensations. So connecting sounds to physical sensations helps our students to learn to be expressive with their music. To then backwards, once they've experienced the physical motion, so you could have them do some motion in any of those words that we just saw to experience the sensation you're trying to get across with the music, and then try to make it sound like that, and then talk about how to make it sound like that. So expressive conducting, you can have them conduct in different ways too, especially for older students. That's a very valid way to approach some of these with younger students. They can move around the room in different ways, in a general music setting especially. Also, student movement, as we just said. And then these are very helpful for word pictures. So once you establish a common vocabulary of feelings of motion, feelings of sensations of motion, and you put words on them, now you can use those words. Let's make this section sound more like a slash and less like a floating sensation or whatever the contrast might be. So for giving word pictures, for giving tying verbal labels onto types of sensation in motion that you try to establish through musical sound. And then, like I say, you give them a vocabulary for expression. These give you a vocabulary for expression, and then you can in turn give your students the similar vocabulary. So, I would like to draw your attention now to a Spotify playlist. You can find it in our Week 7 folder in Canvas. And I've given you the recording of one of my favorite, just slow, expressive, beautiful pieces. Given you a band version, which is my personal favorite. That's what was originally composed for by Percy Granger. And I've also given you a string or mostly string orchestra. There are some other instruments in there too, but the strings are the dominant sound version as well. So even comparing and contrasting the two, they have a very different sound and feel, even though they're exactly the same piece. Irish Tune from County Derry by Percy Granger. So what I want you to do is listen through the piece on Spotify. If you have to get an account, it's free. Just sign up for that and then click my playlist. And you may not, I'm not sure if you have to get an account to listen to my playlist or not, but it's a handy thing to have to demonstrate for your students. So if you don't already have it, this would be a good time to get that. So listen through one or both of the examples. I think you'll love it. Listen with good headphones or stereo system or speakers, whatever you have there, earbuds, and just take a sonic shower in the music, as we would say. Just beautiful, beautiful music. And then think at different times in the piece, which of these, put the list of words up in front of you from the notes, the combination words like dab and punch and all those, and just think of which one would be most effective for showing the sound that you're hearing. And maybe even just kind of by yourself conduct through the piece. It's rubato, but it's a pretty steady, once it gets going past the first few notes, it's pretty steady enough that you could conduct along with it. So that's hopefully a very pleasant assignment for you, and I look forward to seeing you all back in class as soon as possible.